Today I have an opportunity to talk with you about something that we are hearing a lot about in Australia, in Indonesia, and globally. And that's this idea of ESG, environment, social, and governance concerns. And as individuals who are working in or with public policy making, public administration, political science, sociology, it's really important that we think about what these terms that are being used very widely mean and how they can influence our own scholarship and also your own professional efforts once you leave the university, even though I'm sure your professors don't want any of you to leave because you're all so amazing. Throughout the conversation today, let me see if this will work. Can we go to the next slide because the clicker's not working? So the Crawford School of Public Policy, we have a long-standing relationship with Indonesia. Throughout my more than 2 decades of my career, I've worked in Indonesia regularly, and it's a wonderful connection in the region. The Institute for Infrastructure and Society, or I2S, as it's much more easily known, is an autonomous research institute based in the Crawford School, and our focus is on how all this major engineering projects, how infrastructure being delivered to secure the renewable energy transformation, how does this affect communities? How does this affect people at the local level? We know, for instance, that when we put in large road upgrades or new renewable energy infrastructure, this is occurring in places where people live. And so we have issues around land acquisition, resettlement, human rights. We have questions about how does the major infrastructure that we deliver affect people's access to cultural heritage sites? How might it have peoples? So for us, we're looking at what is a very technical engineering exercise from the social and community perspective. And what I'm really concerned about is how does this affect human beings? And we'll go to the next slide. We do this at the Crawford School in partnership. So our work is to do research as unusual. And what we do is we work directly with industry, government, and civil society groups to not only collect our data, but to co-design our research. So these groups here, the Queensland government, the South Australian government, the Victorian government, big private sector organizations like Transurban and Lend-Lease, the groups that actually build and operate the infrastructure, they are all partners of I2S, and they help us to understand what are the policy problems that they're facing, what are the issues that confront them when they attempt to build these really large projects. So everything that I talk about today has been not just created in one of the world's greatest universities, but it has been co-designed and delivered with policymakers and with industry professionals and with, you'll see here, we've got the International Association for Impact Assessment and also the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2. All of our work is delivered as well with these civil society and nonprofit groups. So we're really trying to reflect what is actually happening on the ground through building up a research evidence base. Welcome, we're glad you're here, come on in. We'll go to the next slide, please. And I'll put the clicker down because I don't think it's gonna work. Okay, so we've got, I think now about an hour together. And what I am hopeful for you when you leave this session, I want you to have a really confident and good understanding of what ESG is, because it's one of these terms that gets thrown around quite a lot at the moment. And I think it's really, really helpful if we do what I would call critically unpack that term. So what does it mean? I'm going to introduce a concept, ESG 2.0. So just like your iPhone is probably now like 27.12, ESG we think is at 2.0. We're going to focus on why the S really matters, what is important about the social aspect of the ESG. and the ways in which that S is commonly assessed. Has anybody heard the phrase, what gets measured gets managed? Yeah. So this is the same for the social components in ESG. And often, because we're very good at technically measuring and monitoring environmental components, and we're quite good at evaluation and monitoring in governance, and so the S gets a little bit left behind. So today I'm going to talk about how we can strengthen that. And we'll look at some specific approaches and opportunities that are emerging. So before we begin, I think it's always important to put a new concept in context. And I'm here today in Jakarta. So what does ESG look like in Indonesia at the moment? Yeah, thanks, slides. What I've heard all week since I've been here, I know it's only Tuesday, but it feels like I've been here even longer. Blue, green, digital. Is everybody hearing this coming out of the public policy agenda? We're hearing so much focus in the Indonesian policy agenda on blue, green, digital. And we're seeing as well that the universities are starting to form very leading international partnerships. And LPDP, your main scholarships body, is forming major international partnerships to build up capability and competence around blue, green, digital. There is a very strong focus not only on environmental sustainability, the intergenerational preservation and improvement of local environments, but also on social sustainability. So how do we protect and improve our societies? How do we ensure that we have intergenerational sustainability? What we're seeing as well around blue, green, and digital is that this is not a bounded set of issues. You can't just pretend to look at the blue and not the green and not the digital. They're very much cross-cutting. And for Indonesia, that's particularly true because of the interconnection between your natural resources, your economies, and the types of professions that Indonesia supports. So all of this we can see is driving policy and practice. And in another name, we could talk about blue, green, digital as the Indonesian version of ESG, I think. Thank you. For the next slide. Very important among this as well is the renewables transition. So as recently as November last year, there was a big announcement of a US $20 billion investment in renewables by the Indonesian government. And what we're seeing as well is this focus on the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Very, very recently, I was in Dublin, Ireland. That was about 2 weeks ago. It was a lot colder than it is here. But it was the International Association for Impact Assessment Conference. And the theme of the conference was a fair and just transformation. So not just a transition, but a transformation. And we had delegates, 1,200 delegates from 120 different countries, including Indonesia. And we were really focused on how can we make this transition happen and what needs to be in place to ensure not only that we meet our environmental targets, but also that we protect and support communities through this transition. So that idea of a fair and just transformation, you'll hear that throughout the talk today. And we're also seeing an emergence of new policy and governance requirements to guide the transformation. And certainly in Indonesia, you can see that as new agencies are created, as major investments are announced, and as the government sets its agendas, and we'll wait and see what happens in October with new agendas emerging. But what's going to happen around blue, green, digital, and in particular, the renewables transition. So I hope today the discussion of ESG, these three little letters, which have a big, big meaning, I really hope this discussion will set you up to think about what does this mean as Indonesia moves into a new administration, but also globally as we move urgently to a point where we must achieve climate mitigation and transition to renewables. Thank you. Okay, so the first big question is what? We could say, what are we doing here? But that's a little bit existential for a Tuesday morning. What is ESG? Yes, thank you. We're going to focus, so we'll focus on three questions today. We're going to focus on what, why, and how. And I think those are three good questions to answer for a presentation. So what, why, and how. ESG, environmental, social, and governance. What is it if we want to really put some framework around it? The work around ESG has aimed to formalize both government and private sector attention on non-financial issues. So what we're looking at here is a framework to really legitimize attention to non-financial issues. At its core, that is what the ESG movement is doing and has done. So let's look at this historically. But before we do, can I ask in the audience, because there's a lot of you here today, and also I don't want you to fall asleep, what does ESG mean to you? Is it a term that you're using in Indonesia? Is it something that's relevant to your study or your work? What does it mean when you say it? It's really hard to talk when you're in an audience, isn't it? Does anybody want to share? What does ESG mean to you? I'm like super friendly, so you can say what you think. Aren't I, Reza? I'm really nice. I'm super nice. What does ESG mean to you? Someone has to go first and then you'll feel better.
Okay, I may look like a student. I'm not a student though. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, the nerve, isn't it, Reza? Well, ESG, I think it's more of a buzzword. This is also a question later on that I would like to ask you on your Australian experience. Comparing to Indonesia, we've been on it maybe decades already, and Indonesia also a part of the not victim but the actor who's doing things to the E part, um, where where the internet well it's been case studied for in the international context how business is doing harm, and there goes the social responsibility, corporate citizenships, and so forth. But still, some decades later, ESG is not such a commitment. It's more of a outlook. It's more of an outlook. Well, for me, yeah, like a perspective. For example, I know how business is doing harm, but if I'm asked to buy a product, now you're talking about the economic side of it, I will still get the cheap one, a cheaper one. I don't think about the ethical where it's leading to the ESG. So I think there's a need, uh, more relevant for people, for business, for all kinds of, all walks of life, that it becomes, it goes to the place where it should be. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So maybe ESG is, we would call this a weasel word. Yeah, like a buzzword, a weasel word. Are we just saying this because it sounds good? Everybody's heard of greenwashing. Is this just so that we feel better about what we're doing and so that big companies can just make more money? It's a really good question. And in a minute, I'll talk about this issue of how this has been going on already for a very long time. It's not really new. See, that wasn't too hard to I know you're not a student, and would anyone else like to say, what does ESG mean to you? There's some younger generation people in here. Does it mean something to you? Or your lecturers just told you, oh, we have this international person, you need to go and show up? You know, no takers? I expect that some of you will have more questions and more ideas as we go along. Let's look at what ESG means at the moment internationally. We'll go to the next slide. This is a picture of the beautiful Italian city of Florence. I saw that very recently there was the Jakarta, Italy festival in town. So if you get a chance to go to Italy, you should go to Florence. Florence was the heart of the Renaissance, a period when everything kind of uplifted and was enriched. Right now, I would say we are going through an ESG renaissance. People are all of a sudden rediscovering it as though it were new. And the question is this really a new thing? And actually, what I can tell you is no, definitely not. So if we look at the broader scholarship, you mentioned corporate social responsibility, CSR, corporate stewardship, corporate citizenship, creating shared value. Are these terms that some people have heard before? Maybe. Yeah. There is a history of ESG in one name or another. We'll just go back one slide, please. That goes all the way back to the 1950s in the United States. And you can tell how dated this is because the title of the article, it's up here on the upper left, the title of the article is Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. Because ladies, there weren't any of you doing professional roles back at that time. And what we see is that since the 1950s, this concept has grown and evolved, and it's had a number of different names, but it's always encapsulated the same types of concerns. So how do our activities in business and major government affect and influence societies? And now we can go to the next one. Thank you. ESG 1.0, the original form of environment, social, and governance concerns, it arose out of a movement that we can describe as stakeholder capitalism. Traditional capitalism is focused on delivering shareholder value. The very famous economist Milton Friedman wrote a 1970s article in the New York Times Magazine, and in it he said the famous phrase, "The business of business is business." And he was really arguing against businesses taking up what we call non-technical or non-financial concerns. He was saying the business of business is not ESG. It is to deliver value to the shareholders. So the emergence of stakeholder capitalism, particularly as we saw it come to fruition in the late 1990s, was incredibly important to legitimizing a corporate and government focus on ESG. So around about 1998, we saw through a multi-stakeholder network initiative, something called the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI, emerged. And that was the world's first auditing standard to consistently and systematically monitor, analyze, and report on ESG concerns. Around 2000s, we saw the Millennium Development Goals, which today are better known as the Sustainable Development Goals, and we still have that agenda to 2030, which I don't think we'll meet, but it's been very, very important in concentrating attention on ESG issues. And we have things like the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. There are principles for responsible education management. So for those of you who are undertaking commerce or business degrees, there are actually UN principles that guide those. In the mid-2000s, we also saw, particularly in the United States, the emergence of something called a B Corporation. So a B Corporation is a private sector organization that has a legal remit to undertake. So those organizations legally, it's not about the business of their business is business, delivering value to the shareholder. The business of their business might be to deliver an environmental benefit or to deliver a social benefit. So for those of you who are entrepreneurial or who might be going into the corporate sector, this could be something you want to look into as to whether and how B corporations are developing in Indonesia. And we also have, as of 2006, the International Finance Corporation, so through the World Bank, the Multilateral Development Bank, put out their social and environmental performance standards. And so this is a series of standards that sets expectations for how projects will perform relative to their ESG when major investments are made. And the IFC, just at IAIA 2 weeks ago, announced that they will be reinvigorating and refreshing and renewing their performance standards. So we're expecting those to be updated throughout the next 24 months. Thank you.